August 6th, 1945, 8:15 hours, Tokyo, 90 feet beneath the Imperial Palace. Inside a bunker lined with 4 feet of reinforced concrete, the air vibrated with the familiar rhythm of a losing war. The clocks ticked in unison, the lights buzzed faintly, and the maps on the wall still imagined an empire that no longer existed. For 3 years, Japan's Supreme War Council had met here each morning to manage decline, to stretch dwindling resources, to interpret defeats as tactical pauses, to pretend that spirit could fill the gaps that factories could not. The officers who descended the narrow stairwell that morning expected another routine report. They would hear of shipping losses, ammunition shortages, and the advance of American forces through the Pacific Islands. Then they would repeat the same mantra that had guided every decision since Pearl Harbor. Fight harder. Endure longer. Believe more deeply. At precisely 8:15, the steel door to the communications chamber burst open without warning. Lieutenant Colonel Tishi Yamamoto, a young intelligence officer from the Communications Division, entered without the customary bow. In his hand, he carried a single sheet of paper, a decoded transmission from Hiroshima. It was short, fragmented, almost incoherent. Entire city destroyed by single bomb. Blast radius exceeds all previous bombardment. Unknown weapon type. Casualties catastrophic. Request immediate. The message cut off mid-word. For a moment, the room stayed silent. Then General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Imperial General Staff, took the paper, read it once, and read it again, then a third time. His face did not move, but the silence stretched. He handed the message to Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki. The same disbelief passed across every face. Their first assumption was obvious. An enormous air raid, perhaps 500 B-29 bombers, dropping incendiaries simultaneously. Hiroshima had been bombed before, but never like this. To erase an entire city, a city of 350,000 people, would have required the largest conventional attack of the war. But reports arriving through the morning told a different story. Weather reconnaissance had observed only 3 aircraft over Hiroshima that morning, not 300. Three solitary planes, flying high and unescorted. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff, stood at the wall map where every known American formation was plotted with colored pins. His intelligence officers were experts by now. They knew the routes, the altitudes, the patterns of American bombing runs. They could predict within an hour when Tokyo would be hit. But nothing in 3 years of air war suggested that 3 aircraft could destroy an entire city. By 10 o'clock, reconnaissance flights attempting to reach Hiroshima began reporting something the Japanese military had never seen. Pilots described a column rising into the sky, a mushroom-shaped cloud glowing in colors that defied language. Purple, orange, white, pulsing with internal light. The top of the column reached 40,000 feet, visible from more than 150 miles away. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo received the first eyewitness account at 11:30 hours. A railway official, 15 miles from Hiroshima, described a flash, brighter than 1,000 suns, followed by a pressure wave that knocked trains from their tracks. He said the city center had simply vanished, replaced by a firestorm visible from the hills. That afternoon, the Supreme War Council convened in total silence. The warlords who had ruled Asia now sat in a chamber lit by dim bulbs and the pale reflection of their own maps, and for the first time, none of them spoke. Prime Minister Suzuki finally broke the silence. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "we must consider what this means." General Korechika Anami, the Minister of War, spoke first. "American propaganda," he said. "They want us to believe they possess weapons they do not have. Hiroshima was destroyed by conventional bombing. Nothing more." He paused, waiting for agreement. Admiral Toyoda, who had spent the morning watching radar logs, interrupted an act of near sacrilege in such a room. "3 aircraft, Anami-san. Our radar tracked them. Our observers watched them. 3. No one spoke after that. The silence settled like volcanic ash. For 3 years, Japan's military doctrine had rested on a single premise, that American industrial might could be overcome by Japanese spiritual strength. That while the enemy built ships and tanks, Japan built warriors. That the weakness of democracy, its softness, its comfort, would collapse under the weight of its own casualties. That belief had been the empire's shield since Pearl Harbor. When American shipyards produced cargo vessels faster than submarines could sink them, Japanese leaders consoled themselves. Americans had quantity, not quality. When American factories produced 300,000 aircraft, they said each Japanese pilot carried the spirit of 10 men. When the United States replaced lost carriers at a rate Japan could not comprehend, they said no machine could match the Bushido spirit. But the message from Hiroshima suggested something else entirely. It suggested that America had been fighting with one hand behind its back, that its power, industrial, scientific, and moral, had only now been revealed. By mid-afternoon, intelligence officer Colonel Hideaki Sato was summoned to present an analysis. He had spent the war studying American production numbers, charting their factories, shipyards, and research centers. His reports had been accurate and routinely ignored. Now the generals listened. He spoke quietly. If 3 aircraft destroyed Hiroshima, then we must assume an entirely new class of weapon, something beyond conventional chemistry or physics as we understand them. He hesitated, then added, "If they possess one such weapon, they may possess more." The council sat motionless. In that moment, the entire architecture of Japanese strategy, the equations of courage against industry, sacrifice against abundance, began to collapse. But to understand how shocking that realization was, one must understand what they had believed. 4 years earlier, before Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had warned them. He had studied in America, served in Washington, walked the factory floors of Detroit and Pittsburgh. He had seen the scale of American steel mills, the endless lines of machines, the rivers of coal and oil that fed them. He had told them the truth. "I can run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year," he had said. "But I have no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." They ignored him. They chose instead to believe a comforting story, that industrial power could be neutralized by distance, morale, and spirit. Distance because the Pacific was vast, and American logistics would collapse under its own weight. Morale because Americans, soft and individualistic, would never endure heavy casualties. Spirit because one Japanese soldier, trained to die without hesitation, could defeat 3 or 4 Americans driven only by pay and patriotism. These were not lies told to the people. They were lies the generals told themselves. When the empire expanded across Asia in 1941, these assumptions seemed to work. Singapore fell. The Philippines surrendered. The rising sun flew from Burma to the Central Pacific. But each victory built on a foundation of illusion. By 1945, that illusion was cracking. The Americans had crossed the Pacific island by island, each one a graveyard of Japanese soldiers who had fought to the last man. At Saipan, entire divisions had died in suicidal charges that achieved nothing. At Iwo Jima, 21,000 defenders were annihilated. At Okinawa, 100,000 died, and the home islands lay exposed. Yet even then, the High Command believed spirit could outlast steel. They planned to fight the invasion with bamboo spears if necessary. They believed the Americans would eventually tire. That morning in August, in the bunker beneath Tokyo, that belief died. The men who had built their empire on faith in the will to die now faced a weapon that rendered will irrelevant. A single bomb had accomplished what years of bombing raids could not. It had erased a city, not destroyed. It erased it. Colonel Sato spread aerial photographs across the table. The images were blurred by haze, but the truth was unmistakable. 4 square miles of Hiroshima gone. Not rubble, not ruin. Gone. The ground itself scorched white. Someone whispered that perhaps the Americans had used chemical explosives of a new type. Sato shook his head. No explosive known to science could create a heat flash visible from 100 miles away. The Prime Minister rubbed his temples. "Then we are facing something beyond." Sato nodded. "Yes, Prime Minister. We are facing physics itself." He explained what little his team understood. The Americans had vast research institutions, Harvard, MIT, Berkeley, Chicago. each with laboratories larger than Japan's entire scientific establishment. They employed tens of thousands of scientists and engineers, while Japan employed only a few thousand. For years, intelligence reports had noted enormous construction projects in the American interior secret facilities consuming more electricity than major cities. Those reports were dismissed as exaggeration. Now, in the bunker, no one was laughing. Foreign Minister Togo whispered the question none wanted to ask. How could we not have known? Sato's answer was simple. We did know. We simply refused to believe it. He was right. For years, Japanese intelligence had accurately tracked American production. They knew the United States was building 80,000 tanks, 40,000 ships, 2 million trucks. They intercepted communications about scientific recruitment. They heard rumors of a superweapon. Each report was buried, labeled as defeatist, because to believe it would mean admitting defeat before the war was fought. At 16 hours, Colonel Sato presented a new assessment. The numbers were brutal. In 1944 alone, America produced more aircraft than Japan had built in the entire war. Its shipyards launched escort carriers faster than Japan could train pilots. Its ammunition factories produced more shells in a week than Japan could make in a month. Its research establishment, 130,000 scientists and engineers, worked on technologies Japan could not even conceptualize. The room listened in silence as the arithmetic of defeat filled the air. Admiral Toyoda broke it. The Americans fought this war with one hand tied behind their back, he said. They fought Germany and Japan simultaneously, while developing weapons we cannot comprehend. He looked around the table. They produced more than we thought possible, and they did it while their civilians lived better than ours in peacetime. He paused. They are not merely stronger than us, they are operating on a different level of civilization. No one contradicted him. That night, Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakomizu recorded in his diary, "We have been fighting an enemy we never understood. We assumed their minds worked as ours did, that their limits matched ours. Hiroshima proves we were fighting blind." The next morning, August 7th, confirmation arrived. Reconnaissance planes penetrated the radioactive haze. Major Tsuneyasu Kitamura, the pilot, reported updrafts so violent they threw his aircraft 2,000 feet in seconds. Temperatures spiked his instruments. The photographs he brought back showed an empty circle where the heart of a city had been. Within a mile of the blast, everything had vanished. No rubble, no walls, only earth, scorched flat. Analysts compared the images to Tokyo after the firebombing of March 1945. A raid of 334 B-29 seconds, dropping 1,665 tons of incendiaries. Hiroshima's destruction was greater, yet it had come from one bomb, one plane, one instant. By midday, a grim realization was spreading through the bunker. If the Americans possessed such a weapon, Japan had no defense. No radar could detect it. No fighter could intercept it. No bunker could withstand it. That afternoon, the council reconvened. The atmosphere was no longer defiant. It was hollow. Foreign Minister Togo spoke first. "We must assume they have more." General Anami clenched his fists. "Even so, surrender would mean annihilation of the soul. We cannot," Prime Minister Suzuki interrupted softly. "And if they can annihilate the body?" Silence again. No one answered. Outside, the empire still functioned. Trains ran. Children recited morning prayers. Factories, or what remained of them, still produced shells and rifles. But beneath the palace, the men who ruled that empire understood that the war, in truth, was already over. The message from Hiroshima had done what 1,000 battles could not. It forced them to see. Their strength had been an illusion. Their courage, real as it was, had become irrelevant. They had entered a new world, one where the size of a nation's soul mattered less than the reach of its science. And as night fell over Tokyo, with the smell of rain in the air and the dim hum of the generators echoing through the concrete corridors, one thought moved silently through the room, unspoken but inescapable. They had spent 4 years fighting an enemy they did not understand. And now, in a single instant of light over Hiroshima, That enemy had shown them the true meaning of power. Long before the flash over Hiroshima turned night into day, Japan had already begun to lose the war, not in the air or on the seas, but in its own mind. The empire that would one day march across half of Asia began with an illusion. It was the belief that willpower could replace steel, that sacrifice could outproduce machinery, that courage itself could be weaponized. For a time, it seemed to work. That illusion would carry Japan from victory to victory until it met the reality of American industry and vanished in the light of a single bomb. In the decades before the Second World War, Japan had transformed faster than any nation in modern history. In a single generation, it had leapt from feudal isolation to industrial power. It had built railways, shipyards, and modern armies, while the memory of samurai battles still lived in its blood. It had defeated China in 1895, Russia in 1905, and joined the ranks of imperial powers. But that rise bred arrogance and fear. By the 1932, Japan's leaders believed their empire was both glorious and fragile, dependent on imported steel, oil, and rubber that could be cut off at any moment. The military saw expansion not as ambition but as necessity. In 1937, they invaded China, convinced it would be a quick campaign. It became a quagmire, a war without end, draining men and resources. Still, Japan's generals convinced themselves that spirit would carry them through. They called it seishin, the fighting spirit, a concept that blurred patriotism, religion, and fatalism into a single moral weapon. To die for the emperor was to achieve eternal honor. To doubt victory was to betray the nation. It was a powerful creed and a dangerous one. By 1941, that creed had shaped every level of command. In the war colleges of Tokyo, young officers memorized the saying, "Material strength is transient, spirit is eternal." They studied the campaigns of Alexander, of Napoleon, and drew the same conclusion. Morale decides wars. They saw America as a giant without a soul, rich, mechanical, and undisciplined, a country of merchants, not warriors. The Navy's most far-sighted mind, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, tried to warn them. He had seen America with his own eyes, the cities, the endless factories, the wealth of a continent. He knew the math. "If I am ordered to fight," he said, "I will run wild for 6 months. After that..." But warnings are useless to those who mistake conviction for knowledge. The army called him defeatist. The press called him cowardly. The government dismissed him with polite nods and turned to the men who promised victory. The illusion that Japan could defeat a nation 20 times its size did not begin as madness. It began with logic twisted, but logical. American power, they argued, was theoretical. Ships and factories meant nothing if they could not project across the Pacific. The ocean was vast, and Japan's empire would stretch from Manchuria to the Gilberts, from Burma to the Marshalls. Every island would be a fortress, every garrison a shield. The longer the Americans fought, the farther they would have to sail. Distance itself would defend the empire. This was the first illusion, the illusion of distance. The second was the illusion of morale. American society, they believed, was too soft to fight a long war. It valued life over honor, comfort over duty. Its politics were fragile, its public opinion mercurial. If Japan could inflict 30 or 40,000 casualties, Washington would sue for peace. The Japanese soldier, raised to die without question, would outlast the American who fought to survive. The third illusion was tactical superiority. Japan's officer corps saw themselves as heirs to the samurai. They trained for precision, for audacity, for speed. Their pilots were the best in the world. Their ships, sleek and fast. Their infantry, lean and fanatical. They believed that sheer skill and discipline could negate the material imbalance. If one Japanese pilot equaled 10 Americans, numbers became meaningless. By late 1941, these beliefs formed a doctrine. The war would be short, violent, and decisive. Japan would strike first, cripple American power, seize a vast defensive perimeter, and negotiate peace before America could recover. It was not madness. It was a plan built on faith, and faith blinded them to its flaws. The attack on Pearl Harbor was meant to be a prelude to negotiation. Japan would destroy the Pacific Fleet, occupy the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and then offer a truce from a position of strength. The Americans, they thought, would accept reality. They were wrong. The illusion shattered not at Hiroshima, but on December 8, 1941, the morning after Pearl Harbor, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. America did not sue for peace. It declared total war. And total war was something Japan had never understood. Within a year, the very factors Japan dismissed as weaknesses, democracy, diversity, wealth, began turning into strengths. American factories shifted overnight from cars to tanks, from typewriters to machine guns. The same system that produced refrigerators now produced bombers by the thousand. The same engineers who built bridges and skyscrapers now designed weapons on an industrial scale. In Japan, production meant sacrifice fewer meals, longer hours, national slogans painted on walls. In America, production meant abundance, a nation so vast it could fight across 2 oceans and still improve civilian living standards. As Yamamoto had warned, the first 6 months were Japan's. The empire ran wild: Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. Each victory confirmed the myth. Each success proved that faith and audacity were stronger than steel. But behind the victories, the math was already failing. Japan's population was 100 million. America's 130 million richer, healthier, better fed. Japan's steel output was 7 million tons a year. America's was 80. Japan's oil reserves were measured in months. America's in centuries. And yet the illusion held. The military censored bad news. Defeats were reframed as strategic withdrawals. Officers who questioned strategy were reassigned, or worse. Factories that failed to meet impossible quotas were accused of lacking spirit. The war became not a contest of power, but of faith. To question victory was treason. At Midway, in June 1942, the illusion cracked. 4 of Japan's fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hairyu, destroyed in a single day. Japan lost its most experienced pilots, the core of its naval air power. The official explanation blamed chance, the weather, or fate. They did not blame the codebreakers in Hawaii who had read their plans. They did not blame the flawed doctrine that scattered their planes across decks instead of striking first. They said, luck will return. It never did. At Guadalcanal, Japanese troops discovered that American soldiers, soft, materialistic, untrained in Bushido, did not break. They fought with endurance. They ate better, shot straighter, and could call in artillery from ships over the horizon. Still, reports insisted that the spirit of the Imperial Army remained superior. When units were annihilated, the staff called it glorious self-sacrifice. When convoys were sunk, they said the men had achieved immortality. When production targets failed, they ordered more prayers. The illusions became armor that grew heavier with each defeat. By 1943, Japan's industrial base was collapsing. Its factories lacked aluminum, copper, and fuel. Workers melted down temple bells for metal. Children collected scrap wire. The government printed posters showing smiling women in factories. Each rivet is a bullet in the heart of the enemy. But behind the slogans lay exhaustion. In the United States, women entered the workforce by the millions. Entire cities, Detroit, Cleveland, Seattle, became arsenals of democracy. The Liberty shipyards launched a new cargo vessel every few days. America built so much, so fast, that it began to drown its enemies in abundance. For every Japanese destroyer launched, America launched 20. For every plane Japan built, America built 10. For every shell Japan fired, America produced 100 more. Yet Tokyo's high command refused to see the pattern. They told themselves the Americans were inefficient. They said, quantity cannot defeat quality. They said, the gods favor the brave. The gods were silent. By late 1944, Japan's air force was dying. Its best pilots were dead, replaced by barely trained boys. Fuel shortages kept planes grounded. Desperation gave birth to the kamikaze, the divine wind. Young men, often still in school, given just enough fuel for a one-way flight. It was the ultimate expression of the illusion that death itself could be a weapon. To the generals, it was proof of faith. To history, it was proof of collapse. They convinced themselves that mass suicide could change the arithmetic, that 3,000 kamikazes could destroy the American fleet, that dying bravely was as valuable as victory. But the Americans did not fight by those rules. They fought with machines, with organization, with logistics so vast they seemed impersonal. They built floating cities of steel aircraft carriers that could launch 100 planes at a time. They repaired ships faster than Japan could sink them. They moved armies across oceans as if distance no longer existed. The illusion of distance gone. The illusion of morale gone. The illusion of superiority gone. Still, the propaganda continued. Radio Tokyo promised victory. Newspapers printed victories that never happened. And in the bunker beneath the palace, the generals nodded, pretending to believe their own words. They had built a world where truth itself was treason, where honest intelligence officers were silenced, and optimism became policy. Colonel Hideaki Sato, whose calculations would one day horrify them all, continued to deliver his reports. Each showed the same thing. The United States was producing 10 to 20 times more in every category: ships, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, science, energy, food. He was told to revise his tone, to reflect confidence. He revised the numbers instead upward. By 1945, Japan was fighting with the remnants of its empire. Its cities burned nightly under B-29 raids. Its railways were shattered. Its people lived on barley and rice husks. And yet, in council meetings, generals spoke of a final battle that would redeem everything: the defense of the home islands, the decisive engagement that would restore honor. They called it Ketsugo Operation Decisive. It was fantasy. They planned to mobilize millions of civilians with bamboo spears, to pit school children against tanks. They hoped that if enough Americans died on the beaches, Washington would seek compromise. They were preparing for an apocalypse they still believed they could win. Faith had become madness. Spirit had become suicide. And the empire, built on illusion, was now collapsing under its own gravity. When the message from Hiroshima arrived on August 6th, it did not destroy their cities alone. It destroyed their faith. For the first time, they were forced to confront the possibility that courage was not enough, that there were laws of nature beyond loyalty, that the age of spirit had ended and the age of science had begun. In the bunker beneath Tokyo, as they read the words, "entire city destroyed by single bomb," they were not just reading about Hiroshima, they were reading the obituary of their own illusions. The empire that had begun with belief in the indomitable soul of Japan was ending with the realization that the world had changed and that faith could not armor steel nor sacrifice outbuild science. They had spent a decade preparing for a war of spirit, but the war had become a contest of systems, and systems do not bleed or pray or tire. The illusion was complete, and now it was gone. Morning turned to ash-gray light over Tokyo. August 7th, 1945, the day after the flash. In the underground war room, the men of the Supreme War Council were still awake. No one had slept. The air was heavy with tobacco smoke and disbelief. The message from Hiroshima lay on the table, edges damp with sweat, the ink beginning to blur. For years they had measured the war in numbers, divisions, ships, planes. Now those numbers meant nothing. A single bomb had undone the arithmetic of the empire. Reports filtered in through the static of broken radios. A reconnaissance aircraft had reached the outskirts of Hiroshima. Its pilot, Major Tsuneyasu Kitamura, described what he saw in a trembling voice. A column of smoke still rising into the stratosphere, shaped like a vast white mushroom. The ground below glowed red even after 24 hours. Entire districts were gone. The river ran black. Photographs arrived by noon. Analysts spread them across the map table. What they showed defied comprehension. 4 square miles of city vanished. Streets that once formed grids were now blank scars. The Shima Surgical Clinic, directly beneath the explosion, had simply ceased to exist. Steel girders were twisted like paper, stone bridges thrown sideways, human shadows burned into concrete steps. One officer whispered, "It looks as if the earth itself exploded." No one answered. General Umezu studied the images for a long time. Then he spoke quietly. "This is not chemistry. This is something else." The Americans had created a weapon beyond explosives, beyond fire, a weapon that released the power of the atom, the secret energy that bound matter together. Few in the room understood the physics. All understood the implication. If such power could be harnessed once, it could be harnessed again. Colonel Sato did the calculation. "If they have produced one," he said, "then they have produced more. Industry of that scale never stops at one." A tremor of realization passed through the room. The war was no longer a matter of courage or will. It was a question of time, how long, until the next city vanished. By late afternoon, the emperor was briefed. In his diary that evening, Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakomizu wrote, "His Majesty remained silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low. He said the world has changed." For the generals, that sentence was unbearable. The world had changed, and they had not. That night, Tokyo's sky glowed faintly from distant fires. The capital itself was half ruined from previous raids, yet the people still believed victory possible. The radio broadcast martial songs. Newspapers spoke of a new type of bomb. Only the men in the bunker knew the truth. They gathered again the next morning. August 8th. Fresh intelligence arrived from the north. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan. At midnight Moscow time, Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had summoned the Japanese ambassador to the Kremlin and delivered the message: the neutrality pact was over. The Red Army was advancing into Manchuria with overwhelming force. In the bunker, the news hit harder than the bomb. For months, Tokyo had placed its last hopes in Soviet mediation. Stalin, they believed, might broker peace between Japan and the Western Allies, preserving some portion of the empire. Now that hope was gone. Japan faced annihilation from all directions: Americans from the east, Soviets from the north, British and Australians from the south, Chinese forces pressing from the west. General Anami gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. "We fight," he said. "Even if every city burns, we fight." Foreign Minister Togo shook his head. "To fight is to vanish. We must speak of surrender." The word hung in the air like smoke. Surrender, a word never spoken aloud in that chamber. No one replied. At 11 a.m., a courier burst in with another message. It was brief. "Second atomic attack. Nagasaki. City destroyed. Casualties catastrophic. Communications lost." The room fell into a silence beyond sound. 2 cities in 3 days. The unthinkable weapon was not singular. It was production. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai finally spoke. "They can destroy us city by city, at will. There is no defense. Our fighters cannot find these planes until the bomb has fallen. Our guns cannot reach the sky that high. Our bunkers are meaningless." He paused, looking at the faces around him. "We are naked before the future," General Umezu added quietly. "Our strategy assumes invasion, but if they can erase us without landing, there will be nothing left to defend." For years they had told themselves the Americans must come ashore to win, that they would meet them on the beaches, bleed them until they sued for peace. But the bomb changed everything. The Americans no longer needed to invade. They could simply erase Japan one city at a time. By evening, intelligence estimated the enemy might possess up to 7 additional bombs. Even if the number was exaggerated, 1 more would be enough. The council sat in silence as the meaning settled. Continued resistance was no longer heroism. It was extinction. That night, Emperor Hirohito met privately with his advisors. He spoke a single sentence that would later shape history. "The unendurable must be endured." Those words carried centuries of weight. They meant surrender. But to say them publicly would require navigating an army still bound by the code of death before dishonor. August 9th turned to the 10th. Outside Tokyo, the summer air was heavy, filled with the hum of insects. Inside the bunker, Men whispered of annihilation. Reports from Hiroshima described people turned to shadows, water that boiled in rivers, survivors wandering naked and burned, their skin hanging like cloth. Doctors wrote that the wounded died without visible injuries, their hair falling out, their blood turning black. Science had become horror. Colonel Sato tried to explain radiation, though he barely grasped it himself. "It is invisible," he said. "The bomb leaves poison in the air and soil. Those who breathe it die later. The city is not merely destroyed, it is cursed." Prime Minister Suzuki covered his face with his hands. "Then the world itself has changed." He was right. Humanity had entered an age where destruction could occur in a single instant, faster than thought, beyond mercy. The Japanese High Command, trapped in its own myth of endurance, now faced a truth that no courage could alter. They had reached the limit of what flesh could endure. August 10th brought the first official offer of surrender. It was transmitted through Swiss diplomatic channels, cautiously worded, Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration, provided the emperor's sovereignty was preserved. In Washington, the reply came 2 days later, deliberately ambiguous. The emperor would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers, but his ultimate status would depend on the will of the Japanese people. That ambiguity split the Japanese government. Hardliners saw it as humiliation. Moderates saw it as salvation. General Anami refused to yield. "Better to die as a nation," he said, "than to live in shame." Admiral Yonai answered softly, "We will not live at all if we continue." The debate grew so bitter that for the first time, the council could not reach a decision. The emperor himself would have to speak as sacred being, forced to choose between annihilation and surrender. On the night of August 14th, he did. In a private meeting, he declared his will to end the war. "I cannot bear to see my people suffer further," he said. "We must bow to the inevitable." Even then, the illusion of victory refused to die quietly. Young officers of the military police attempted a coup, hoping to seize the imperial palace, destroy the surrender recording, and continue the war. They failed. Dawn broke over a city on the edge of ruin. At noon on August 15th, 1945, radio stations across Japan broadcast a voice no one had ever heard before the voice of the emperor himself. His words were formal, archaic, carefully chosen. He did not say, "surrender." He said the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He said a new weapon had the power to destroy civilization. He said the nation must endure the unendurable. Millions listened in silence. Some wept, some bowed, some simply stared at the floor. The illusion was over. In the ruins of Hiroshima, survivors heard the broadcast through broken loudspeakers. In Nagasaki, monks rang temple bells for the dead. In Manchuria, soldiers threw down their rifles and waited for capture. The empire that had promised eternal victory was dissolving into surrender. But the meaning of Hiroshima was larger than defeat. It was revelation. It revealed the true scale of human power and the abyss beneath it. It revealed that science had escaped the control of strategy, that war had crossed a threshold from destruction to extinction. For Japan's leaders, it was also mirror and reckoning. They had built their nation on the belief that spirit could overcome matter. The atomic bomb proved the opposite. Matter had triumphed. The energy locked inside a single atom was greater than the faith of millions. Colonel Sato wrote in his final report, "We fought, believing that courage could conquer material. We learned that courage without means is nothing." The men who survived that August would spend the rest of their lives living inside that sentence. The unthinkable weapon had ended not only a war, but an age. It marked the death of the samurai's shadow and the birth of a new world where knowledge was power, and power carried no honor. In the silent ruins of Hiroshima, amid glass that had melted into rivers, amid the ghosts burned into stone, the 20th century began. And in Tokyo, beneath the palace, the generals who had worshipped war understood, too late, that they had been fighting not just an enemy across the ocean, but an idea of the future, and that the future had already won. The war was over, but no one in Tokyo yet knew how to stop fighting. On August 15th, 1945, the emperor's voice floated across a ruined country, thin, crackling, almost drowned by static. Most had never heard it before. To his subjects, he had always been a distant divinity, a symbol in white robes glimpsed only in photographs. Now his voice was weary, human, filled with the slow cadence of resignation. He spoke not of surrender, but of enduring the unendurable. He spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, of the duty to save the people from extinction. He spoke of peace. Across Japan, the words drifted through shattered loudspeakers, through the dust of burned cities, through villages that had long ceased to receive mail. In factories without roofs, workers stopped their machines. In the mountains, soldiers stood frozen beside their rifles. In schools, children bowed to the radio. Some wept quietly. Others screamed that the message was a forgery, an American trick. A few officers drew their swords and ended their lives where they stood. The empire had died, but the habit of war did not die with it. In the imperial palace, guards still stood at attention, though there was no longer an empire to guard. In the underground bunker, the lights still burned. The Supreme War Council gathered one last time. The faces were grey, expressionless, drained of everything but exhaustion. General Korechika Anami, the Minister of War, had been the most defiant voice in the room. Now, he sat silently, staring at his hands. The day before, he had told colleagues, "If the Emperor decides for peace, I must obey." That morning, he left his office, wrote a final note, "I am responsible for the military. My death is my apology," and opened his abdomen with a short sword. His aide finished the act with a bullet. It was an old ritual, ancient and futile, but it was how a man raised on the illusion of noble death faced the reality of defeat. That same morning, American aircraft dropped leaflets announcing the emperor's message across the cities that still stood. Many Japanese citizens saw the printed word, "surrender," for the first time. In Hiroshima, survivors carried the leaflets through ruins where the living still searched for the dead. In Nagasaki, the bells of Urakami Cathedral, half melted, rang again. At noon, a second broadcast repeated the message. Across Asia, the echoes reached men who had not yet learned they were defeated. In Burma, Japanese troops held their trenches as British patrols approached, unsure whether the war had truly ended. In China, entire regiments refused to lay down their arms until they heard confirmation from Tokyo. Some fought for days after the announcement. For years, others would remain hidden in jungles, waiting for orders that would never come. Surrender, in its own way, took longer than war. In the Pacific, American ships halted their bombardments, but remained on alert. No one knew if the Japanese would honor the emperor's word. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, prepared to occupy a nation that had once vowed to die rather than submit. On August 19th, Japanese envoys flew to Manila under white flags to meet Allied officers. The Americans noted how they bowed, how their uniforms were threadbare, how their eyes looked hollow but disciplined. They signed the preliminary arrangements for surrender, then returned to Tokyo to prepare for the final ceremony. On August 28th, the first American troops landed on Japanese soil not as invaders, but as occupiers. No shots were fired. The soldiers stepped onto the tarmac at Atsugi Airfield and looked around at the strange quiet of a defeated empire. The air smelled of dust and smoke and the faint sweetness of rotting grain. They expected hostility. Instead, the Japanese guards saluted them. It was the first peaceful meeting between two enemies who had once vowed mutual extinction. 2 days later, General MacArthur arrived. He stepped from his aircraft wearing sunglasses, pipe in hand, a study in deliberate calm. To the Japanese watching from the windows, he looked like a man from another planet, tall, relaxed, unarmed. He would soon become the most powerful foreigner in Japanese history, ruler of an empire without a throne. He drove through Tokyo in a black staff car, past crowds that stood silently, past women bowing and children staring. The capital was a skeleton city, 1/3 of its buildings gone, streets lined with ashes and twisted girders. The smell of burned wood hung heavy even weeks after the raids. MacArthur's car passed beneath the walls of the imperial palace. Inside, Emperor Hirohito waited for his first meeting with the conqueror of his realm. The meeting took place on September 27, 1945. No one in Japan had ever seen such a thing. The emperor standing beside an American general. Hirohito wore mourning coat and gloves, his expression stiff but composed. MacArthur stood beside him, in khaki, towering, his hands on his hips. The photograph that emerged from that meeting would become a symbol of the new world, the divine and the democratic, standing side by side, one diminished, the other ascendant. But before that image could exist, the war had to be ended formally. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. The USS Missouri rode at anchor, its deck polished to mirror shine. The harbour stretched calm and endless, filled with ships, destroyers, carriers, transports, the full, visible weight of American industry at peace. At 9:02 hours, the Japanese delegation came aboard. They wore black coats and top hats, the ceremonial dress of diplomacy. Among them were Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umezu, who still carried the stiffness of men trained to die rather than bow. They walked across the deck, where hundreds of American sailors stood in silence. The contrast was overwhelming. The slender, formal Japanese figures moving through ranks of men in khaki, the steel of the ship gleaming beneath them, aircraft circling in the blue above. MacArthur stood at the table prepared for signatures. Around him were admirals and generals representing the Allied nations. The sun glared off the water. The wind barely moved. The silence was total. Shigemitsu stepped forward first. He removed his hat, adjusted his artificial leg, a relic of an assassination attempt years earlier, and bent to sign. Umezu followed, his pen trembling slightly. One by one, the representatives of the Allies signed after them: United States, China, Britain, Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, New Zealand. When it was done, MacArthur spoke briefly. His voice carried across the deck and into history. "It is my earnest hope that a better world shall emerge from the blood and carnage of the past." Then he turned, and the ceremony ended. Above the harbour, American aircraft flew in formation, hundreds of planes, blocking the sun. Below, battleships stretched to the horizon. The Japanese delegates looked out across the bay and saw the physical proof of what they had refused to believe for 4 years. An empire of machines, an industrial civilization operating beyond imagination. General Umezu, watching the armada, whispered to his aide, "We surrendered aboard a battleship they built faster than we planned a single operation." He was not exaggerating. The Missouri had been constructed in less than 3 years, while Japan's shipyards had struggled to repair their own vessels. For the men who had commanded the war, this sight was not merely humiliation, it was revelation. They were seeing the scale of the world they had denied existed. After the signing, the Japanese envoys departed in silence. On shore, word spread quickly. The war was finished. There would be no last battle, no final charge. The empire that had once stretched from the borders of India to the mid-Pacific now existed only as memory. In the days that followed, American occupation forces began to spread across the islands. They found a nation on the edge of famine, millions homeless, transportation shattered, disease rising, the economy gone. Yet beneath the ruins, they also found something else, a people weary of war, ready to rebuild. MacArthur's headquarters moved into the Dai-ichi building, across from the imperial palace. From his window, he could see the moat, the stone walls, the pine trees beyond, and the ancient roof where the emperor now lived under foreign command. From that office, the new Japan would be designed, its constitution rewritten, its army dissolved, its education system reformed. But before reconstruction came reckoning. In the months after surrender, Japanese officers were required to compile reports explaining the causes of defeat. For men trained never to admit failure, the task was unbearable. Yet many did it with brutal honesty. Colonel Sato wrote his final report in September 1945. He titled it, "Why We Lost." His first line read, We lost the war in December 1941 when we attacked an enemy we did not understand. He described how every major decision had been shaped by illusion, how accurate intelligence had been suppressed, how optimism had become policy. We believed our own propaganda, he wrote. We attributed to the enemy our weaknesses, and to ourselves their strengths. He ended with a sentence that history would remember. Courage cannot defeat chemistry. Spirit cannot overcome steel. Other reports echoed the same theme. Admiral Yonai, once Navy minister, wrote, "We began the war believing democracy made them weak. We ended understanding it, made them strong. Diversity gave them talent. Freedom gave them innovation. Wealth gave them the power to wage total war." Former Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki told occupation officials, "We thought we were fighting merchants who valued comfort over honor. We discovered we were fighting the most productive civilization in history. The numbers confirmed it. During the war, the United States had produced 88,000 tanks, over 2 million trucks, 17 million rifles, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. It had maintained civilian prosperity while waging global conflict. It had built cities in secret to house its scientists, spending more on a single project, the Manhattan Project, than Japan spent on its entire military in 1944. The atomic bomb was not only a weapon, it was the symbol of that system, a machine civilization harnessing the invisible laws of nature. Japan's leaders saw now that they had been living in another century. Their factories had been workshops. America's were worlds of their own. They had sent boys to die with swords against tanks. Their opponents had built cities underground to split the atom. For the Japanese military, it was a moral collapse even deeper than defeat. Their entire worldview, the code of honor, the worship of sacrifice, had become obsolete. The very qualities they had glorified had doomed them. Some officers, unable to bear it, chose death. General Anami was not the last. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, father of the kamikaze, apologized for sending thousands of young men to die, then took his own life in silence. Others withdrew into obscurity. Some began to write, trying to make sense of what they had done, what they had believed. The younger generation, emerging from the ashes, began to see those men not as heroes, but as relics of a vanished world. The age of the warrior was over. The age of the engineer had begun. The Americans governed through restraint. There were no mass executions, no looting, no revenge. The occupation became an experiment. Could the destroyer of a civilization also rebuild it? By 1946, the new Japanese constitution was being drafted under MacArthur's direction. It renounced war forever. It placed sovereignty in the people, not the emperor. It guaranteed rights that had never before existed in Asia. The same nation that had once declared itself divine now declared itself democratic. And through it all, the memory of August 1945 remained a silence deeper than shame, a wound that never closed. In Hiroshima, survivors began to rebuild among the ruins. They planted flowers along the riverbanks where the dead had floated. In Nagasaki, churches rose again, their bells forged from melted scrap. Every year, on the anniversary of the bombing, people gathered to ring them a single clear note that carried over the water and into the world. The collapse of the empire had begun with a single message: entire city destroyed by one bomb. But what followed was more than defeat. It was transformation, a civilization forced to face its own reflection and to start again. The men who had ruled Japan in war would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain it. Most came to the same conclusion. They had not merely lost a battle, they had lost an idea, the idea that courage could replace knowledge, that faith could overcome physics, that purity of spirit could defeat the mathematics of industry. History had closed that chapter forever. On the evening of September 2nd, as the sun set over Tokyo Bay, the sailors aboard the Missouri watched the horizon turn gold. The ship's guns were silent. The air was still. Somewhere across the sea, in the ruins of Hiroshima, the first lights of reconstruction flickered small, fragile, and human. The empire had fallen. But something else was beginning. A different kind of power. A civilization reborn, not through conquest, but through humility. And in that silence, the lesson of the war took its final shape. They had learned too late that determination means nothing when faced with an enemy who possesses both determination and 10 times your capacity to give it form. That the true victory belonged not to spirit, but to the system that could build a world and rebuild it again. Autumn 1945. The air over Japan was clear for the first time in years. The smoke had lifted, the sirens had stopped, and a country that had once spoken of eternity now measured time, day by day. The war was over, but its echo had only just begun. Across the islands, a new sound emerged. The hammer on wood, the shovel in earth, the low rumble of trains carrying food instead of troops. The same rail lines that had moved weapons now moved rice. The same ports that had launched armies now unloaded grain from foreign ships. In the streets of Tokyo, children played among the charred foundations where houses had been. They did not remember victory or defeat. They remembered hunger. The occupation became routine. American jeeps rolled through streets lined with bowing civilians. Black market stalls bloomed in the ruins. The stars and stripes fluttered from buildings that had once displayed the rising sun. And for the first time in modern history, the Japanese people began to see foreign soldiers not as invaders, but as the keepers of order. General Douglas MacArthur sat in his office overlooking the imperial palace. From his window he could see the stone moat and the pine trees, and beyond them, the rooftops of a city that no longer existed. He understood that he was not merely commanding an occupation but shaping a future. His instructions to his staff were simple. Build a nation that will never again choose war. Under his authority, Japan was remade. Factories that had forged weapons were ordered to produce tractors and radios. The army and navy were dissolved. Women received the vote. Schools rewrote their textbooks, teaching not imperial destiny, but citizenship. The new constitution, drafted in a week, renounced war forever. Its Article 9 stated that the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation. It was the most radical sentence ever written in the language of empire. For the men who had led the war, this new Japan was unrecognizable. Some cooperated with the occupation, others withdrew into silence. Trials were held in Tokyo, where judges from across the world sat beneath the flags of nations that had once burned their cities. Generals and ministers stood in the dock, listening to translators speak their own words back to them. Some argued that they had served their emperor. Others claimed they had never known the truth. A few spoke honestly. They said the truth had been everywhere, and they had refused to see it. Witness after witness described how reports of American strength had been ignored, how scientists had been mocked, how belief had been used as a shield against reality. The judges listened and took notes, but no sentence could equal the punishment already inflicted by history itself. When the verdicts came, some of the guilty were hanged, others were imprisoned. Most faded into obscurity. Yet among them was a strange unity of tone, not rage, not defiance, but bewilderment. They had believed that they understood the world, and the world had proved larger than belief. Outside the courtroom, the real reconstruction began. Millions of former soldiers returned home to find nothing left. They built houses from scrap, grew vegetables in bomb craters, and waited for the next winter. In those months, Japan discovered something it had never valued, the quiet dignity of survival. In Hiroshima, the ash was still warm when the first green shoots appeared. Peasants from nearby villages came to help the survivors. They built shelters from rubble, dug wells, and cleared the roads. Within a year, a streetcar was running again through the center of what had been obliteration. People stood in line just to ride it once to prove that life could move. In Nagasaki, fishermen returned to the harbor and cast their nets into water that still carried ashes. They caught fish and sold them for a few coins. The city rebuilt around its church, and every August the bells rang for those who had vanished in a flash. Year by year, Japan changed. Factories reopened. Children went to school wearing patches on their clothes and hope in their eyes. Electric lights returned. Trains ran on time again. The nation that had once equated peace with weakness now built its strength through peace. By the 1950 the same discipline that had forged war machines was forging radios, cameras, and cars. The same precision once used to polish swords now shaped lenses and circuit boards. In a single generation, the country that had been bombed back to stone rose as an industrial giant this time, waging a different kind of war, a war of production, design, and patience. But beneath the miracle lay memory. Every August, sirens still sounded at 8:15 a.m. in Hiroshima and at 11:02 a.m. in Nagasaki. People bowed their heads and remembered the light that had ended their world. Children who had not been born in 1945 grew up learning that moment as the center of their history. For them, Hiroshima was not only a tragedy but a warning carved into the national soul. Across the sea, in America, scientists who had built the bomb wrestled with their own reckoning. Some defended it as the price of ending the war. Others saw it as a crime against creation itself. In Los Alamos, Robert Oppenheimer quoted from ancient scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He spoke as a man who had looked into the same light and seen what it meant. For the Japanese, the reckoning was different. It was not guilt for the bomb. It was shame for the blindness that had made it inevitable. A nation that had worshipped its own purity was forced to accept imperfection. A culture that had equated sacrifice with virtue now learned that the highest virtue was to live. Historians would later call this transformation the post-war miracle. But to those who lived it, it was less miracle than penance, a daily rebuilding of a country and a conscience. In the parliament that rose on the site of wartime ministries, politicians debated budgets instead of battles. Factories measured success not in shells but in exports. Children recited poems about peace. Science became a path to healing. The same energy that had once split the atom for war was now harnessed for power plants and medicine. Japan became the only nation ever to be nuclear victim and nuclear advocate in the same breath. It joined international treaties to ban nuclear weapons. It sent aid to countries it had once invaded. It taught its children that peace was not weakness, but strength under control. And yet, in quiet moments, the old question remained. What had it all meant? For men like General Umezu, who lived to see the occupation end, the answer was simple and terrible. He told interviewers, "We lost because we never understood our enemy. We believed our own myths. We confused fanaticism with strength." He paused, then added, "The bomb did not defeat us. It only proved that we were already defeated." Admiral Toyoda, writing in 1946, called it the collapse of illusion. He said, "We believed democracy made them weak. We learned that democracy made them limitless." To him, the atomic bomb was not a miracle of science, but the inevitable result of a system that valued truth over obedience. Others saw it in more spiritual terms. Priests in Shinto shrines spoke of a divine lesson that arrogance had brought down the empire, and humility had saved the nation. Buddhist monks walked through the ruins, reciting sutras for the dead of all nations, saying that suffering unites where victory divides. Among the survivors of Hiroshima, the reckoning was written on their bodies. The hibakusha, the bombed people, became living testimony. Their scars told a story no propaganda could erase. They spoke in schools and parliaments, telling children what a flash could do. They did not speak of revenge, but of responsibility. They turned pain into warning. Outside Japan, the world listened. The Cold War was beginning, and nations raced to build their own unthinkable weapons. Each test in the desert or the ocean carried the memory of that first mushroom cloud. Hiroshima became a word in every language, not a city, but a symbol of what humans could do to themselves. In Tokyo, American flags came down in 1952. The occupation ended. MacArthur departed. Japan was sovereign again. Yet the country he left behind was not the one he had found. It was richer, freer, and haunted. The ghost of the old empire lived on only in ceremonies and stone. The new Japan looked west towards science, trade, and a future built on what had once been its defeat. Generations later, the reckoning endures. Each anniversary, survivors gather at the Peace Park. They stand before the Genbaku Dome, the ruined skeleton left as it was on August 6th, and they bow their heads. The river flows quietly beside them. Paper lanterns drift on the water, carrying names and wishes for a world without bombs. Above them, the city glitters with lights, powered by the very science that once destroyed it. The men who had sat in the bunker beneath Tokyo would not recognize this Japan. They believed honor was found in death. Their descendants found it in life. They believed the sword was the measure of a nation. Their descendants learned that its measure was the plow, the microscope, the schoolbook. The reckoning was complete when a nation that had once sent its sons to die for glory, sent its scientists to cure disease, and its engineers to build bridges. When the descendants of Hiroshima's victims welcomed the descendants of their bombers as friends. When the people who had once believed that God favored their empire learned that God had no favorites, only laws of nature, and that those laws could serve either creation or destruction. From those ashes rose a single truth. Strength without wisdom is destruction. Wisdom without compassion is hollow. The war had shown both. In the end, the atomic age did not end humanity. It revealed it. It showed what knowledge without restraint could do, and what humility after ruin could rebuild. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki stand as monuments not to American victory or Japanese defeat, but to the moment when civilization saw its own reflection in fire and chose, at last, to look away. The historian's voice fades, leaving only the image. A quiet morning over Hiroshima, sunlight glinting on the river, the hum of a modern city living among its ghosts. The world goes on, as it always does. But beneath its motion runs a current born in 1945, a memory of what happens when the illusions of pride meet the reality of power. And so the story closes, where it began with a single message, transmitted through time rather than radio, repeating the lesson written in light and shadow. They learned too late that courage cannot defeat chemistry, that faith cannot armor steel. That determination means nothing when it stands against the engine of a civilization that has mastered both matter and mind. The bomb ended a war, but the reckoning it began has no end.